Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Cordero. I'm the Deputy Director of Business Services here at the Rhode Island Department of State under Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea. I'm very excited to welcome a special guest speaker with us today. About a month and a half or so ago, we ran a multi-part series called Nonprofit Boot Camp that sort of went through all of the basic things to consider when starting a new nonprofit, including registration requirements, maintenance requirements, what the state law requires, charitable contributions, how you manage that. We had an accountant, or a CPA, I should say, come in and talk about filing for federal tax exemption and maintaining that status. So basically, nonprofit from soup to nuts. One thing we didn't get to was actual board management, how you handle pulling a board together, what you need to have, and then how you handle the day-to-day operations, what you need to do to keep that healthy and in line with what is required under the law. So we are working very closely with the Rhode Island Foundation on that topic and on other resources that we share for nonprofits here in the state. And Jill Pfitzenmayer is the Vice President of Capacity Building at the Rhode Island Foundation. She's graciously agreed to speak to you on that topic. A couple minor housekeeping items. This is being recorded. As you can see, the little red blinking light up in the corner. Everybody who registered for this session will get a copy of the recording. So you're welcome to take notes, but you will have something to refer to. You will also get a copy of the presentation materials that Jill will be using today. So you're going to get a copy of everything once it's all pulled together and put in a pretty little package ready to send to you. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have questions in the meantime or after. As for right now, if you have any questions, and we hope you do, at any time during the conversation today, please use the chat box. We'll be monitoring it very actively throughout, so that's your way to get in touch with us now. And with all of that said, I will very gladly turn the digital microphone over to Jill.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all of you for being here this afternoon. Some people are en route, I can see. That's awesome. I am not going to take up too much airtime, I hope, with a slide deck. I do have a few slides. Don't panic when you see they're very text rich. However, I'm going to unpack all of that with you today, and you'll get a copy of the deck. So hopefully it will give a bit of an overview and some detailed information if you want to dig in a little bit more. So that said, with your permission, I'm going to start the slideshow, and then I expect that we'll have plenty of time for questions on your individual situations, and I really look forward to that. So let me pull my screen up. All right, hopefully everybody can see that clearly. And this is a presentation that is designed for those of you in a variety of places in your life cycle. So I want to take the lens back a little bit and just talk about nonprofits, just as we might think about small businesses. Organizations go through life cycles just like we do, just like businesses. And it's common to kind of start out at this early grassroots or invention stage when your nonprofit might be the twinkle in somebody's eye. There's something that you are gravitating towards as a mission or a purpose. And then once that kind of mission or purpose gets teased out and you have some collective sense of interest, you may move into the next phase, which is incubation or startup phase. And that's usually 2 or 3 years into a nonprofit's life cycle. The next stage will be adolescence. Adolescence, just like it is for people, can sometimes be a little clunky for organizations where you are hammering out your mission, perhaps adding to your programs and services. And as far as governance goes, this is a place where there's typically a significant shift in your governance. And so I will talk a little bit more about that. I'm not going to talk too much about these stages, but maturation, stagnation, maybe things aren't going quite as you'd planned, or you're either going downhill, maybe you're merging, maybe you're consolidating with another organization. But we're really going to focus our comments on this first part of the life cycle. So I told you not to panic when you see a lot of words on the screen. This just gives you a flavor about how nonprofit boards tend to function in each of these growth cycles. So in the grassroots stage, this is where you maybe have gone past the twinkle in somebody's eye. I like to think about board members in this stage as kind of the kitchen table gang. So these are the folks that, you're sort of having supper with, and you're saying, somebody ought to, and you move past that initial stage of thinking through what is the problem that you're trying to solve and how will you solve it. And so the people who are with you are usually the worker bees. And I apologize, my phone is going off here. Usually the worker bees, people who are interested in moving an idea from the beginning stages to get it up and running. Maybe at this stage, a board, a committee, a group of advisors, it depends on what you call them. They may start to think about how do you begin to raise some money to enact your mission. So that's generally what's happening in these very early stages. The line between board member and volunteer is pretty blurry in this stage. Now, perhaps you've moved past that and you're into a startup phase. And so you start to put a little more formality around your governance structure. You probably have a small but passionate group of folks who are willing to move from committee assignment to actually serving on a board. The board members tend to sort of still be friends and family of the folks who are beginning this entity together. As we move into adolescence, what happens is the board begins to expand, and you may have some folks who join the board who weren't were not part of that initial startup group. So that can be a little bit awkward if you're bringing new people into the fold to work on the mission together. It also can be very exciting because you're starting to think about how to add board members that represent either skills or attributes that aren't shared by the initial founding board members. And so in an adolescent stage, you're not focusing quite as much about operations. You're beginning to think about the bigger picture and the longevity of the mission. And then finally, in a mature organization, as you can see here, the board tends to increase in size. I would say the grassroots organization probably starts with 3 or 4 board members. I think that's the minimum number that's required for the IRS. As you get into a more mature organization, the board size, typically a nonprofit board in Rhode Island has between 12 and 15 members. So you can see where there's that growth in numbers. The board begins to function a little more in policy and oversight, a little less in day-to-day operations. The board typically starts to think more about sustainability, which is fundraising. And hopefully there's a strong committee structure for the board so that there are not just board members doing the work for the governance of the organization, but there may be at-large community members, and that's an excellent way to build out a farm team for the board. So this slide is a slide that I use in almost every presentation when I talk about nonprofit governance. This is not opinion. This is steeped in best practices for all nonprofit boards. And what this means is that even if you are a grassroots organization or a young startup organization, and you don't have any paid staff members, and the board essentially functions as both the staff and the board, you still have to be involved in these governance responsibilities. And the 10 responsibilities fall into 4 major categories: strategy, personnel, finances, and reputation. So let me just spend a minute or two on each of these. And incidentally, I mentioned that this is not my opinion, that this comes from a body of work around best practices in nonprofit governance. And if you really want to learn more and dive in, I highly recommend going to a website called boardsource.org. They have tons of free resources. There are lots of templates for you to use. It's a membership organization, but you can also just join and get some free stuff. Kristen, I see that there are a couple of chat questions, and I was not able to.
I was just reminding folks to use the chat and letting them know as you go, adding in links and that kind of stuff.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I said I would pay attention, and all of a sudden I realized I'm not. So you can interrupt me at any point. Okay, so BoardSource is a great resource, and it's BoardSource who really has outlined these basic board responsibilities. So remember, whether you are working for a startup or a young organization or an organization that's been around for 150 years, every board has to engage in these responsibilities. So it's the board that determines the mission and purpose of the organization. That's often a shared sport when you have staff and volunteers. The board must make sure that there's effective planning, and that usually takes the form of making sure that the organization either has a business plan at the front end or a strategic plan for an organization that has been around for a little bit. And then the board is responsible for monitoring programs and services to make sure that what the organization is doing has some fidelity to the stated mission. In the personnel bucket, the board hires the executive director and supports him or her. And the board is also responsible for making sure that there's a deep enough bench to be able to replace itself. So the board builds itself over time. It's also the buck falls squarely on the board's shoulders. The board has to make sure that there are adequate financial resources, human resources, and then ultimately that the board is protecting assets and providing proper financial oversight. I caution nonprofit boards who don't really like getting into money issues that you really don't want to be that organization on the front page of Projo for not providing ample oversight over finances. It's really important to have a good handle on the money that's coming in and the money that's going out. And that relates to the final 2 buckets of responsibilities around reputation, which is that the board is responsible for ensuring ethical and legal integrity and making sure that the organization is viewed favorably in the public eye. And so if you join a nonprofit board, all of your friends, all of your neighbors, all of your family members should know you're on that board because you're talking about it and you're talking about how great that organization is. So I mentioned that it is getting from startup into adolescence can be a little bit tricky. And what happens is when you have that initial group of folks who are passionate and excited and want to be pulling the tires out of the river, if you're an environmental organization and that's your mission, and that's great, but you also have to make sure that your governance is great. Sometimes what happens is that the line between volunteer and board member can become a little blurry. Or I also hear sometimes from organizations, well, we've been around for a while, our volunteers are really tired, and so we'll take anybody who raises their hand. I want you to move away from that scarcity mentality and really have an abundance mentality, because there are lots of fantastic board members out there who may not know about your work, but if they did, they would be very interested in joining your board. So if your board, if your mission and your organization is awesome, your board should be also very, very awesome in support of that mission. So when you think about board recruitment, don't cry when you see this long list. It is an example of a way for you to have attributes and skills around the board table so that you can bring in expertise that you may not necessarily have on staff if you have staff members, or you may not have the capability to bring in consultants. So when boards start to move past that group of friends at the kitchen table into being strategic and thoughtful about recruitment, I often advise them to start with a skills assessment of the people who are currently on the board. So if you have 7 people on the board, kind of start with an inventory about what are their professional skills, what is their age, where do they live, are there any socioeconomic populations that they represent, all of those kinds of things. And that way you can begin to think about what's missing at our board table. Lots of nonprofits start out thinking that they want the wealthiest people in town to be on boards. That may or may not be a good strategy, because honestly, the wealthiest person in your town may not care about your mission, or they may not have time for your mission. And so you want to really think about wealth in a broader sense. Who has the time, treasure, and talent to contribute to the board to be able to further your mission and deepen the organization? So these are some of the skills that are very valuable on any nonprofit board. If you go to the BoardSource website, they have a comprehensive board skills matrix. You can pick and choose what makes sense, but I think for early stage nonprofits, it's very helpful to have an attorney on the board. It's very helpful to have somebody with financial skills or business planning skills. Increasingly, communication, social media, those kinds of skills can be very valuable. If you have somebody with content expertise or in your field, that is also a very valuable tool. And then thinking about some of these other skills as it relates to the kind of work that you do. If you're an organization that has a physical space, then perhaps a real estate person or somebody such like an architect or an engineer might make sense to you. But you can see that you are thinking about who are the people that we need to move this mission forward, and not just who's raising their hand and willing to meet on Thursdays at 7. So the biggest challenge, I think, for an organization that hasn't quite hit the place where you have a paid staff member, and that is a really big jump for lots of nonprofit organizations, is how do you manage, as a nonprofit board, how do you manage the volunteer aspect and the governance aspect? And the answer is you really have to do both. You are both the board of directors and you are leaders of the staff. So what you want to do is think about how can we bring people in who are interested in the governance piece and willing to oversee the staff functions of the volunteers that may be working with you. So a very concrete way to do that is to make sure that every board meeting has both a governance component and a staff meeting component. Sometimes what happens for boards is you get completely mired in the operations and you forget, oh yeah, somebody's got to be doing governance up here. So what does that mean? So what I recommend is that you have sort of a standard agenda that with 2 sections. At the beginning of every board and staff meeting, I highly recommend that you have some kind of community building opportunity. I always feel sad when I get invited to board meetings and it's at 6:30 and there's no coffee, no one has cookies, I'm starving, everyone's tired, they've come. Try to make it a pleasant experience. So bring some food, just have it be comfortable, just check in with everybody. How's everybody doing? Having a mission moment is also another really powerful reminder of why you're doing what you're doing. So maybe it's a letter from a parent, maybe it's a video from a recent event, something that is tangible that helps orient the board around why their work is impactful. When you evolve to the point where you have committees and committee reports, instead of listening to lengthy reports that you've hopefully already received in writing, the vehicle for kind of short-circuiting all of that is to use what's called a consent agenda, where everybody assumes that you've read the meeting minutes in advance. And so the committee or the board president says, does anyone have any questions for any of the committee reports? If not, motion to accept. So you are streamlining your time and making sure that you're spending your valuable time face-to-face doing real work, not just relitigating stuff that's already happened. Some kind of board education or training, I think, is really helpful at every board meeting. Doesn't have to be a huge lift. Maybe it's just reminding people on the board about the difference between restricted and unrestricted assets, just things that kind of keep you as a learning organization. And then you're finally down to this important thing of strategic board topics. So maybe those are 2 or 3 big issues that you're trying to wrestle with. Perhaps it's a progress on a goal and a strategic plan, or gosh, we need to start a strategic plan. So if you spend the first part of the meeting on governance, maybe that's 40, 45 minutes, then perhaps you have another 45 minutes to talk about operations, and that's the staff meeting part. So I'm going to stop the share and open up the floor. This was like a super Cliff Notes version, but I want to kind of get a sense, what made sense to you? What feels like you don't know what the heck I'm talking about? What questions or worries do you have?
And I have made it where anyone who wishes can unmute themselves and just ask out loud if you wish, or you're welcome to type anything in the chat, either way, whatever is comfortable for you. And maybe while we wait for folks to get up the courage to ask a question, I had something that popped into my mind while you were speaking, Jill. I was thinking about holding these meetings, and questions that we hear with some frequency is what record keeping should look like for these meetings. Like, what has to be in my minutes? Is there a certain person who has to be responsible for that? You know, how detailed do I have to hire a stenographer kind of thing, or can they be shorthands? I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, you know, the main arbiter of these things is the IRS, and there are some requirements that they have. And one of the quirky IRS requirements is that you have some record retention policy, whatever that is. So that's something that I strongly encourage you to and work that into your bylaws. Just, you know, we will hold on to our records for 7 years. I think that's the amount of time. And I would say most organizations tend to tilt in the direction of taking down word for word meeting minutes, which are agonizing for the person who's doing the writing and for anybody who is doing the reading. I think meeting minutes should be streamlined and useful so that you can look back on a meeting that took place 6 months ago and say, wait, what did we say we were going to do? What did we decide? What was the vote and who's responsible for it? You know, I've seen meeting minutes that are literally 2 columns. What's the issue that we talked about? What was the determination? And then what is the follow-up who's responsible and what's the follow-up plan. And so however you do it, they should be useful for your organizations and easily translatable for the person who's going to take on the board role after you relocate to Paris, which is my version of hit by a bus, which I hate. So does that make sense, Kristen?
Absolutely, yeah. And actually that kind of segues into another question we frequently get, which is about board turnover and succession. And it's something that we see in our office. You know, we deal with I see nodding heads. So some people are also thinking along these lines. You know, we see the administrative side of things. People just have to file an annual report every year with us. And that's, you know, your only touch point with my office. But if you don't have that kind of clear pathway for who does what on your board, and a way for the next person in line to know exactly what it is they're supposed to be doing, that can be really difficult. Even passing along, you know, passwords and IDs and various numbers and stuff. So I'm sure there's plenty of resources out there or best practices out there, but I figured you would be a great one to ask in terms of best practices for board succession.
I love that question, Kristen. So when you are in the early stages of your organization, you probably want to start to compile an operations manual. And that's all the things like where are the bank accounts and what are the passwords and who's responsible for cleaning the bathroom on Thursday. That is different from, and it can be pretty free form because that's the operations as it relates to your specific organization. But you should also have a set of bylaws, which I get asked a lot about. Would you just send me like the perfect set of bylaws? And there is no perfect set of bylaws. So BoardSource may have some examples. There are lots of sample bylaws out there. The only thing you need to worry about is two things. Number one, you have to have some specific language in there that the IRS specifies, which has to do with what is your mission, how many people are on the board, what is the process for replacing board members, do you have term limits, those kinds of things. That you would want to include position responsibilities. There's some of those things that you could just take a look at some boilerplate bylaws and then modify them for your purposes. Do we have any attorneys on this call? Talk to me, right? Kate, anyone? Okay, so I'm married to an attorney, so I love lawyers. However, when lawyers get their hands on bylaws, they tend to make them a little bit hard for the regular person to read and make sense of. So make sure that your bylaws are sufficiently clear so that people know what they're doing, but not so crazily minute that nobody understands what the heck they're saying. Every officer position should be defined in the bylaws. So that's typically a president or a board chair, a vice chair, sometimes a treasurer, and a secretary. If there are subcommittees, those should be clarified in the bylaws. What is their mission? What is their purpose? There should be language about dual relationships, things that just kind of help you to clarify what your corporate entity, what your corporate structure is. I want to say a word about term limits. This is my favorite thing to rant about. Many nonprofits have term limits and don't follow them. Some nonprofits don't have term limits and it's a lifetime sentence on the board. And I will tell you that in both of those instances, you are absolutely shooting yourselves in the foot. You must have turnover so that you can attract people who have time and energy to give to your organization for a specific period of time. And then they rotate off to make space for the next talented person who's interested in your mission. So if you, I hear a lot of organizations worry about losing institutional knowledge and, oh, we can't recruit a new treasurer because the only accountant in town is on 14 boards. So stop. if you're having trouble with board recruitment, you need to have an internal conversation about what are the barriers that are preventing us from having interesting, passionate people that we know they're out there be part of our mission. Is there anything about us that makes it hard for someone to raise their hand to be considered for our board? So have that courageous conversation with yourself, have term limits. The typical term for nonprofits in Rhode Island is 2 3-year terms. Some organizations do something that I think is very smart, which is they'll have the first term is 1 year. So before you sign on for a multi-year commitment to the organization, you're on for 1 year. You see how the board member performs, you see what the board member thinks of you. And if the performance is up to snuff, then they can be considered for a second term of 3 years and maybe a third term of 3 years. So that's just jumping it up to a 7-year term. But if you have those quantities in your bylaws and you follow them, you are engaging in a really strong practice around nonprofit governance. Kristen, did I hit all of your questions? Because it was a dense question.
That and more. Yes, that was awesome.
Okay.
I'll also note, because we also get the question as like, can you give me sample bylaws? One of the other things to look for when you're checking out those widely available sample bylaws online is just make sure you're looking at the state that is governing those bylaws. It usually says, this entity will be governed by the law under the laws of the state of Michigan, which is not what you want. If you're a Rhode Island nonprofit, you want to operate as if you're governed by the laws here in Rhode Island. You don't want to find the organization in hot water and have to answer to Michigan's laws that you have nothing to do with. So yes, using all those resources that are out there on the great blue yonder of the World Wide Web, really, really awesome. Just make sure you understand every little bit of it. And if you want to get an attorney involved, maybe it's with a draft that you're comfortable with and you just want to get some answers. Like, I think this means this. Is that right? And then your billable hours are, for half an hour instead of an hour and a half, and you've saved yourself 2/3 of the money that you otherwise would have spent.
That's excellent advice. And I also will advise organizations that if there's another organization that does something somewhat similar to you and they would be willing to share their bylaws, it's public information. It shouldn't be too much of a lift, but at least you can take a look and see how other organizations are crafting their position descriptions or their committee structure or their term limits. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but to Kristen's point, you do need to have legally binding bylaws that everybody in the organization understands. And so it's also helpful to expand some of the bylaws to perhaps have a broader set of responsibilities that an individual board member may have, sort of a board member position description. That can be very helpful, as well as committee charters, officer roles. And what you're starting to do is to build out a portfolio for the current and future board, so that people coming into a board role will know, okay, here's our bylaws, here's our mission, these are our major programs, this is what our budget looks like, these are what our fundraising goals are, so that you are educating and building that infrastructure, which the board 10 years from now will look back and thank you profusely for doing that hard work. All right, team.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Thing, just keep in mind that you can amend bylaws too.
Yes.
So, while of course you should try to craft something that makes sense at the outset, if you find something is not working with a majority vote, usually of the board, you can vote to amend those bylaws so that they do work for you. So you're not set in stone. You want to, be very comfortable with them, but just keep in mind that you can flex a little bit as you grow and learn.
That's such a great point. And a tool that works very well for organizations, and this may be for organizations when you're a bit more formalized, maybe in your adolescent stage, is to have a governance committee. You may have heard of a nominating committee, which is a subset of the board that begins to identify potential board members through a nominating process. A governance committee is like nominating on steroids. So you are not only considering the current slate of officers or people who would be considered for board positions, you may be responsible for the care and feeding of the board. So perhaps that is conducting that annual skills analysis. It may be updating the bylaws. It may be updating any other descriptive materials that relate to your board, and just making sure that there's sufficient board education throughout the year. So organizations that have a governance committee tend to operate extremely well and efficiently, and it's just a great tool, particularly for a board chair, to be able to have a team to rely on in keeping the operations going. So Jay Kilsey's iPhone has a hand up.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Jill and Kristen. Thank you. I appreciate you mentioned about succession and term limits. Our organization is actually a parent group at a middle school. So that's 3 years. Unless there's the chance of having overlapping children, you might get someone who would want to stay on longer. But we have, and we're brand new. We're just getting this process started with a formalized board. So we did have a discussion about, turnover. It would have to be, it's quite brief. So making sure that we are on top of, I like the idea of the manual, making sure that we can turn it over as we go, because probably, unless it's a unique situation, 3 years would be the longest that we would have somebody. So I just didn't know if there's, you touched on it, and I think that's very helpful, but, for an organization that probably will have quite a bit of board turnover, just anything that you could add to that is great.
So thank you for bringing that up. And I have an immediate response and then a sort of a bigger response. My immediate response is that it means you're going to have to do constant talent scouting. So every volunteer and you definitely have to have a committee structure so that there's both board members and at-large folks who are on the committee, so you can have that vetting process. But another option for you, and maybe anyone else here who's thinking of starting an organization, is to work with what's called a fiscal sponsor. And a fiscal sponsor means that you are operating a program or service under the auspices of another organization that has the magical 501c designation from the IRS. So if I am running a youth program and Kristen is a YMCA, and so, I'm sort of aligned, but I don't really want to go through setting up my whole board and finding a bank and all of that kind of stuff, I might approach Kristen to have her her organization serve as a fiscal sponsor, so that I would become a program of a larger organization. These arrangements typically are financial, so it may be a portion of the money that I bring in as a program. It can be anywhere from 3 to 12%, depending on how much you might need from a fiscal sponsor. But it's an excellent way for a young organization to get off the ground, because you are focusing on the programs and services, and that's usually where everybody's energy is activated. And you're not thinking so much about the infrastructure. A fiscal sponsorship should be a formal arrangement. It should have a written document that captures what the reciprocity looks like and how it gets reviewed. Again, there are tons of resources out there for what a fiscal sponsorship might look like. There's an organization called TSNE Mission Works in Boston. They have fiscal sponsorships as a product line. They also have lots of resources. So if you wanted to explore that, you can still have your own 501c3 and have a fiscal sponsor. So I'm just I don't want to make your brains blow up or anything, but I just want to put out options for you to consider. So how does that land?
Great, thank you.
Okay. What else, team? Hello, Paula. This is the quietest governance group ever. I usually get tons of what if questions. Paula, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, my apologies for being late, and I had trouble getting in, but anyway, so I don't know what I missed, but I do have a question, and I'm not sure if it's germane to this particular forum, but it's a question about board members.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any restrictions that prevent board members from becoming staff members?
What typically happens is that if there is a staff vacancy, and it depends on what level of staffing. And let me just explain what I mean by that. The board of, if you remember from that hierarchy of board responsibilities, the board hires the executive director, or the whatever you call the head of the organization. That person hires everyone else below them. The board does not hire the executive director and the finance person. All right, unless for some quirky reason the board wants to have a flat reporting structure, which I would advise them to take a breath before doing that. So if a board member wanted to be considered for a position reporting to the executive director, they, I think, would have to go through the typical application process and step off the board. The question might be whether they are stepping off the board permanently or taking a leave of absence. And so this is a situation I'd want to have really clear communication between the executive director and the board chair about what is the process. If a board member is interested in the executive director role, again, they would probably step off the board and then recuse themselves from any conversation about that position. So, this is tricky business in Rhode Island. Many of us wear many hats. And I think that a general rule of thumb is to be transparent and avoid relational conflicts as much as possible, and kind of over communicate if there are any conflicts of interest. And your bylaws should have some language in them about conflict of interest and how they get resolved. So you would want to follow whatever you've outlined in your bylaws. Paula, does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. And it would be for the executive, I was thinking about the executive director position.
Yeah.
There's a few people, new people that I've managed to convince to come on board. And, my time is limited, so I'm already thinking about succession planning. So.
I think that's really smart. I think that's really smart. And even if you're in the starting phases of getting a nonprofit off the ground, you really should be thinking about who's going to be sitting in my seat 5 years from now, 8 years from now. It's not too soon. And the organizations that are successful are the ones that are really thinking about that from the get-go and really sharing skills and resources so that there is a clear understanding of who does what and what success looks like.
Jill, another thing that comes up now and again, and I don't know what the answer to this really is, but turmoil among board members is a thing.
Yep.
That plagues a lot of especially smaller organizations when you are the kitchen table gang, or one step beyond that. And it can feel like when that happens, the whole thing's just going to come crumbling down.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, having really strong outlines for who does what and what happens if somebody's not doing what they're supposed to be doing is helpful. But do you have any other insight as to managing turmoil interpersonally, I guess, when you have a bunch of different passionate personalities on the board, all striving for the same mission, but maybe not always rowing in the same direction.
It's a great question, and I get this question all the time. And what I typically advise is that the board have a retreat where they sort of take a breath, spend half a day on a Saturday. Hopefully it's an opportunity for somebody outside of the board to be serving as a facilitator, where you're not doing regular board business or staff business, but you're really talking about how are we doing? What's working in our governance? What's not working? Always you have to be thinking about how are we serving the mission. Sometimes what happens, particularly with younger nonprofits, is that it is a lot of interpersonal passion, and people get wrapped up in the personality and, oh, this is going to hurt so-and-so's feelings if their term limit's up and they don't want to step down. I don't want them to be hurt. We're doing this work in service of the mission. So that's why I keep pounding away on having that mission moment, so that if there are challenges or hurt feelings, you can really talk about them openly, resolve them. And if it gets to a point where you can't resolve challenges on your own, then it may be time to bring in a consultant who has organizational development chops, who can really kind of revisit what was the wind up to this? Is this a structural issue, or is there lack of clarity about who's doing what? Or is this some bad behavior, some board bullying, or some other kinds of behavior that's interfering with the group dynamic? So, I think the hardest and most admirable job of any nonprofit is not the executive director, it's the board chair. Because the board chair is the person that is the conductor of this orchestra, making sure that everybody's playing their instruments and kind of being aware of when somebody's out of tune, when somebody is taking over. And we do a lot of consulting with board chairs who are kind of struggling with how do we get this going. So have courageous conversation, have a board retreat, bring in a consultant. I have one more thought, by the way. Sometimes what happens is the board meetings can get kind of stale or repetitive, and or you end up talking about the color of the cocktail napkins and not what our fundraising goal is, right? So I often suggest that at every board meeting, you designate somebody as the person on the balcony. And so that person is a participant observer in the meeting. They are attending the meeting, but just kind of keeping track of when there are points in the conversation where it was more facilitative, where there are points in the conversation where there was some thwarting behavior, and then gently reports that back to the board. I have worked with many organizations that have used this technique, and within 4 or 5 meetings, the entire conversation, the entire dynamic has become elevated, because you're developing a sense of self-awareness that aligns your behavior in the boardroom with the mission of the organization. So that's just another approach that you could consider.
Thank you, Jill. And I think it makes sense to, oh, Paula has a question. Go ahead, Paula.
It's more of an observation than a question, but I assumed the role of executive director in July. And last month we had our first in-person board meeting. It was via Zoom prior to that. And I found the difference just astounding. Everybody showed up. Everyone was engaged. People got fired up about a couple of things, and, showed a lot more enthusiasm than they had been showing in the Zoom. And so I'm trying to figure out how to, so the board chair and the executive thought that, suggested that we meet in person 1 month and by Zoom the next month. We meet monthly.
Mhm.
And so I am thinking I will suggest to the board chair that an in-person meeting seems to get more participation by the board. And I've been fortunate. I just brought on 2 new board members who are really like full of energy and gung-ho. And for their benefit, I think, to sit around the table is a much better energizing situation for them, to get them on board and for them to bring other people to the table who they know and who have a passion for what we do. So
Yeah,
I'm going to try it. I don't know if I'll have any luck, but I think that's part of what happened for us anyway, COVID, and people kind of just fell off, and
yeah.
couldn't keep the momentum going. So
Thank you for sharing that. And I think your gut instinct is right. It is way better to have a board meeting in person, particularly because if your meeting is spent really hammering out strategic issues, big picture questions, and you want to have robust debate and conversation, and doing that in person is just much more energizing. I've attended a ton of board meetings since COVID in this forum. And 2 things I've learned. One is that many people like this a lot because it's super efficient. However, if you have somebody like me who's a fairly aggressive facilitator, and I am looking at all of your faces on the squares, it may be that this format is actually a bit more engaging. What I have learned is that you have to pick one or the other. You cannot do both. So we've all probably had those torturous meetings where 5 people are in the room, 4 people are on the screen, nobody can effectively hear anybody, and it's really an unsatisfying exchange all the way around. Those hybrid things don't work. So either have an all Zoom meeting with fairly aggressive facilitation, or have an in-person meeting. So I think experimenting 1 month to the next, Paula, makes a lot of sense. Any other final questions for the people who I see their names and have been very quiet? So on the very last slide that you'll receive is my contact information. I can be reached at the Rhode Island Foundation via email, phone call. We are still working in a hybrid version, so we're not having any in-person meetings at the foundation, but please do reach out to me. And if you are on a board or you are thinking about joining a board and you want to have me come to a board meeting, I would be delighted to do that. I love to talk to boards, and nonprofit board service is a very high level of commitment, and this works way better in person when I do it. But this is my bowing to you, board members. Thank you. You are the lifeblood of the nonprofit sector, and organizations couldn't function without you. So thank you for your work and your passion. If I can be of any help to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Jill, thank you so much. This was wonderful, really enlightening, a lot of really, really good information. And I know people always appreciate having an actual person that they can reach to instead of just the name of an organization. So that is not underappreciated. Did we have a question? I see someone unmuted.
No, I just wanted to thank you.
Oh, okay. All right. I don't want to step on your toes. So again, we're going to sort of reel in this video that we're making right now and make it a little prettier and a little easier to digest. And then everyone will be receiving an email with a link to the video that you can return to, a copy of Jill's slides as well. So those will all be coming your way. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us today. And, if there's something in your nonprofit life that we can pull together for you, we can hold a conversation like this on something that's really meaningful for you and you have lots of questions, please do let us know. I will put my email in the chat. You're welcome to reach out directly to me, and I am the facilitator of all of those sorts of things. So you tell me what you need and we will get it done. I promise, as much as I can. And thank you all very much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, wonderful rest of your week, and please feel free to reach out to either us or to Jill with any questions you may have. Take care, everybody.
Thanks,
Lovely.
Kristen. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care.